All right, look, I know a book that came out in the year 2000 about branding and technology. Probably it sounds like something that'll be really outdated. One of the chapter names is Patriarchy Gets Funky. I mean, who uses the word funky? And it also unironically uses the word discotheque at one point.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
But in all seriousness, this book holds up extraordinarily well, particularly when you consider that branding by definition will change some, at least, over the decades. Like, heck, I mean, if I did a video on the YouTube algorithm, it would probably be pretty irrelevant 6 months from now, and you'd have to brand things in like a different way, like, 6 months to a year from now. Man, I've tried to record this video so many times, and there's just so much to say. I don't even know what to talk about or where to go. So I'm just going to quote the back of the book, because when in doubt, quote the back of the book, right? In the last decade, no logo has become an international phenomenon and a cultural manifesto for the critics of unfettered capitalism worldwide. As America faces a second economic depression, Klein's analysis of our corporate and branded world is as timely and powerful as ever. This is important, equal parts cultural analysis, political manifesto, rat mall memoir, and journalistic expose. No Logo is the first book to put the new resistance into pop historical and clear economic perspective. And then to quote Rolling Stone's review, superstar intellectual of the new left that hasn't caught up with her yet. Yeah, I totally agree with that Rolling Stone quote. Like, when you think of anti-corporate attitudes and stuff, you really don't think of the 90s. This book came out in the year 2000. I mean, there's a lot of anti-corporate thought, both like on the right and the left right now. But like, the 90s was like, I don't know, it was considered like a good time. I think the economy was doing well, whatever. Or was it though? I mean, sure, it was doing better than it is now. I think that's fair enough to say. But in the pages of this book, it's almost like a prophecy. Naomi Klein isn't writing this, she's not trying to like predict everything accurately, right? I think she's really coming in with a more journalistic attitude. I'm quoting from the conclusion, and by trends, this quote means anti-corporate trends. Quote, "It is sometimes difficult to tell whether these trends are the start of something genuinely new or the last gasps of something very old. When I started this book, I honestly didn't know whether I was covering marginal, atomized scenes of resistance or the birth of a potentially broad-based movement. But as time went on, what I clearly saw was a movement forming before my eyes." And yeah, I mean, like, look, I mean, if you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign and just, like someone like Sanders, if he ran for president in 2000 or 2004, I don't think he would have really caught on the way he did in 2016 or 2020 with a very anti-corporate message. And I shouldn't say anti-corporate, but like the back of the book said, condemnation of unfettered capitalism. And that's really what the Sanders campaign was about, like him going after Amazon for not paying taxes, like any money in taxes. And there was a statistic that I saw recently, like 70% of tax avoidance is done by the top 1%. And that was in the context of Trump's tax returns coming out. And obviously he paid nothing in taxes the last 10 or 15 years or whatever. But like, Trump is not an outlier. He's not an aberration. This is just what, like, rich companies avoiding paying taxes and rich people avoiding paying taxes is as indicative to the last 3 decades as reality TV is. But this book really isn't about like the taxes so much. It's more anti-corporate, calling out corporate problematic behavior, let's say. So again, this book came out in 2000, and there was a lot of reporting on sweatshops. New York Times, the Oregonian, because Oregon is where Nike is, and Nike was obviously one of the biggest abusers and users and abusers of overseas sweatshops. Like, people in these sweatshops made like $1.60 a day in Vietnam, for example, and 3 meals there cost $2.10 a day. So yeah, I mean, I'd imagine it's pretty hard to survive if that's like your living condition. Now, at that base level of thinking, which is what a lot of exposés at that time talked about, they really focused on that surface level, like, oh, like, it's so bad, like, they're paying their workers so little. But you might think, hey, why can't these people just go get a different job? Or like, what were they doing before this all happened? Like, can't they just like be local farmers like they used to be? Well, no, they can't, because much of the land within their country was sold to these multinational corporations to, open up these sweatshops. A lot of these sweatshops that Naomi Klein visited were actually former U.S. military bases in that, Indochina area, the Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia area, and Indonesia as well. And a lot of the sort of Western boycott moments from this book, boycotting like Nike, for example, for their sweatshops, or Shell Oil for their exploitation of people in Nigeria, and they're sort of like doing deals with, the Nigerian military dictator of the time, whose name I'm drawing a blank on. They actually did remind me a bit of BookTube, and how, people got together basically and kind of boycotted Book Outlet. To briefly summarize that story, which many of you probably already know, Book Outlet was a company that sponsored some booktubers, and they were mostly white booktubers. And then, obviously the murder of George Floyd happened, and it was like, hey, Book Outlet, why don't you have better representation, basically, was the general complaint. And instead of like trying to, respond to that criticism, they put their foot in their mouth and said like, hey, I forget exactly how they worded it, but they wanted like family-friendly advertisements or something. And then people pointed out that like the white people that they sponsor like swear all the time and aren't like family-friendly, quote unquote. And it was kind of like, well, why can't black people be family-friendly? Or that's what it like seemed to be that they were implying, and they like just kept handling it poorly. So like BookTube boycotted them basically. Even if people can get cheaper books from them, it's not worth it to them because they're like seen as fairly unethical. I didn't explain this Book Outlet boycott too well, so check out this video of the situation explained much better. And that's like kind of similar with Nike. Why get clothes from them? They essentially used slave labor, as outlined within this book, and by many journalistic outlets in the 90s. And again, not slaves. They were paid $1.60 a day. So not slaves, but like clearly exploited workers. This book points out fairly accurately that Reebok was also doing these exploitative things, Adidas, and as Nike's stock prices were plummeting, Adidas and Reeboks were going up basically at the same rate as Nike's were going down. Now that's obviously not ideal, because you're trying to force Nike into doing the right thing, which is with a boycott, which is good. And there were some marginal labor practices that were somewhat implemented. Klein actually uses the example of there was a spotlight shined on specific places to make some of those places less exploitative of the workers in those places, but outside of the spotlight, most of the area was shrouded in darkness and people could get away with everything there. So I kind of see that with the booktube example and the book outlet example, where yes, it was beautiful that we're all, boycotting book outlet, and I'm not buying anything from them, but there's still like this huge broad problem, right? Like Amazon posts up their factories in these cities and they don't pay taxes. These cities need tax revenue to have halfway decent schools, or have schools that aren't grossly underfunded, which leads us back to this book. How do these schools in inner cities get funding? Well, a lot of times they have to sell out. They'll let Nike come in. They'll let, Coke and Pepsi come in and like put their vending machines in schools, or, name a gymnasium like the Nike gymnasium or whatever. And they'll pay a lot of money for it. And it's just them doing a PR stunt. And it's a net positive for them. If they pay Portland, Oregon, $200,000 to help their schools, and it's like, well, great, that's a noble cause, but why not? Why don't they just pay taxes? They've outsourced their jobs, which means less jobs, less tax revenue coming in, and like obviously a worse living condition for the people here who lost those jobs. And they make like a crazy amount of money selling their clothes. With that, like a little bit of their insane profits, they'll donate to help a school. We see this now with people like, Jeff Bezos or whatever. Like, let's say he donates $1 million to a cause. Do you know how much of a percent 1 million is of 170 billion, which is his net worth? Like, you may be like, oh, it's great, like he's donating $1 million, but that's only like 1/1000th of a percent of his wealth. Meanwhile, he's not paying taxes. His company's not paying taxes. His workers don't have health care. And by the way, Amazon, I know I'm complaining about Amazon, and this is a book about branding in the 90s, and Amazon didn't really exist in the 90s, although it did, but it was very small. Klein, actually, again, she's kind of a prophet, but she's like, yeah, like, of course Amazon is going to be huge. She specifically said probably Amazon, but if not Amazon, there will be another company that does like the same thing and sells things, delivers things. And she's right. Amazon is like massive. It certainly had the largest growth in that time period of American companies. All right, sorry, the lighting's a little worse now because I'm recording this part a few hours later. Where was I? Yes, bad things happening around the world. So you may think, oh man, this seems like very sad, very negative. And like, I don't want to hear about like teenage women in Honduras getting abused by their boss in like forced labor situations where they make like not enough money to eat food. I mean, like, no one wants to hear about that. And it just seems like just sadness without solution. And I think Naomi Klein does a good job of talking about the fighters. And even, like in the 90s, the internet wasn't what it was today. So it was harder to organize, but some people started organizing on the internet in the 90s, which is great. And the internet made it and has continued to make it much easier to spread information and have sort of a global solidarity. Someone could talk about protesting Shell in Nigeria and share that information with someone protesting Nike in Indonesia and talk to like students at Berkeley about that, and connectivity. And like, can I do like a tech press conference from 1996? Connectivity, the world's future, blah blah blah. But like, in all seriousness, it has that. And Klein talks about how like that sort of use of the internet to organize against these companies has come into play. And there were also some good old school protests, like vandalizing billboards that are selling cigarettes in New York City or whatever, putting up pictures of like, the disgusting lungs from like 10 years of smoking or whatever on those cigarette sales billboards. Klein actually talks to one of those, one of those like vandalizers or artists, street artists, like whatever you want to call it. And it's like, oh, wouldn't it be great if everyone had a wall that they could post on, or everyone had their own billboard, I think he worded it as. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is kind of like social media is the capitalist answer to this critique, isn't it? And yeah, I think social media companies have, again, in terms of like connecting movements together, incorporating international solidarity, and even organizing locally, that's all been actually helpful. Obviously, in like China or whatever, these social media companies will sell out at the first chance they get, and and like give all these names to like the local authoritarian dictators or whatever of not necessarily China, could be any country, right? Saudi Arabia, Israel, basically anywhere. If the social media company wants to be involved, they have to play ball with the local government. But yeah, of the 4 parts, I think the part 1, no space, is the part that the capitalist system has done the best job of addressing, again, with the internet, with social media, at least in countries like the United States, within the last 20 years, I should specify. Now, what were some of the other activists, hacktivists, culture jammers? First of all, I hadn't even heard of like a lot of these sort of types of protests, like culture jamming, but that's basically like using a company's logo and like making your own t-shirts that like mock that company's logo. More specifically, their brand, like it could be their motto, logo, something about their product that's problematic, as in like cigarette companies, for example, and how that relates to like lung cancer. Like, let me find some from my notes. There was an album called Dyspepsy, and basically it would have, I listened to one of the songs and it was just like saying horrible things like killing orphan dogs, Pepsi, and it would just say like a horrible thing and then say Pepsi. And that didn't lead to a lawsuit. A more common song that you guys might know is the Barbie Girl song, like I'm a Barbie girl, like, and at the time, like, every girl in America had a Barbie doll, and Barbie had this sort of like persona of, being, a good girl or whatever, and like a good role model, I guess. And then, but if you like actually listen to the song Barbie Girl by Aqua, I think, you'll realize like it's like criticizing Barbie. So actually the company that makes Barbie sued that band for defamation, and there was like an entire chapter about companies suing people, like songwriters, just anyone who said something that they didn't like, for defamation. And sometimes it would work, and the person who was, defaming or whatever that company would get censored, or they would be like intimidated out of talking, basically, because of lawsuits. But sometimes it actually backfired, like in the case with the Barbie Girl song. It actually attracted more negative attention than the company wanted. This was also demonstrated by the McLibel trial, which basically, a few Greenpeace activists were like, they were like pretty radical at the time, like meat is murder activists. And I think like the veganism movement since the late 90s has come a long way, and it realizes that shaming people for eating meat isn't really a good strategic approach. But I digress. So the McLibel trial has like these Greenpeace activists, and McDonald's does like the normal corporate thing of like, all right, we can bully these guys into not talking, let's sue them. And usually companies can settle. They'll be like, all right, stop like saying these bad things about our company, stop handing out this pamphlet that shows all the bad things this company does, and instead we'll only sue you for like $10,000 instead of taking you to court and getting like millions of dollars from you or whatever. Millions of dollars that these people probably didn't have. But they don't want to go to court, the corporations, because if they do go to court, it is a way to force them to open their books. And that is something that they don't want to do. And when you say, hey, these people are defaming me because they're saying our McDonald's food isn't nutritious in response to our advertisement saying it is nutritious, then if you go to court and you have, a health professional defending the statement that, McDonald's is delicious, nutritious. It is delicious, by the way, but defending the statement it is nutritious, you come up with absurd statements like, let me get the exact quote, Coke is nutritious because it provides water, and we need water to survive. That is what their McDonald's health expert said in court. And McDonald's actually won the case because the activist made some statements like McDonald's causes cancer or something. And there was another one where they were overreaching a little bit on McDonald's, but the judge was like, yeah, but like most of these claims, like, hey, McDonald's is not nutritious and they say they're nutritious in their ads, like just very basic, like things like that. They won those parts, the activists did, but McDonald's won overall because, some of it was considered defamation by that British court. But like, it wasn't a win because the whole case itself was just a PR thing. Like McDonald's didn't want this stuff in the news. The activists did want, how unhealthy McDonald's is it in the news, and the activists got it in the news. And Klein, the reason I say this book is like fairly hopeful and optimistic is, at the end of that story, she's like, I went to interview these two activists, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I expected a fairly large Greenpeace office with multiple employees and computers in like, a nice office in London. But instead I went to like, the basement of a former jail to like the back closet where there was just two people, a computer, a phone, and a fax machine. Obviously that doesn't sound optimistic, but at the same time, if like, just like, a bare bones ragtag group of pair of people can do this and just totally embarrass one of the largest multinational corporations in the country, in the world, then, then there's a lot of things we can do. Overall, corporations, I think, have learned not to get involved with those sorts of lawsuits. They realize that, there is no winning for them because McDonald's won, right? But they lost because they got bad PR, and that's all it was about for them. I do think if Klein wrote this book now, a lot of this stuff would be framed a little bit differently. Like, I feel like the title would be different, and the sections might be different too. No Space might have been a chapter instead of a section. I don't know what it would have been called instead of No Logo. Maybe No Non-Corporate or something it would be called. I don't know. I'm not great at making names. Or Anti-Corporate. But yeah, there's so many things I just didn't mention in this review about like what garbage things corporations do. I'm going to be reading The Shock Doctrine maybe in like 2 months. Join my Discord if you want, which is in the comments or, description. I always say comments instead of description. This month in October, I'm going to be reading A People's History of the United States. And I'm going to try to, read one good classic nonfiction book every month. And, I'm going to have daily shout outs in the Discord as well to sometimes it might be an artist. Sometimes it might be a booktuber. Sometimes it might be someone like Naomi Klein, which is my shout out for yesterday, and I'm shouting out her Screen New Deal article, which I will also put in the description. When you read stuff like No Logo, with like the broader context that this came out in 2000, and Naomi Klein is just like hitting the nail on the head constantly, and like, again, she's almost a prophet, but that puts things like the article The Screen New Deal into even more context. Also, I'm a firm believer in reading someone's essay before you like actually read their book, just so you get their writing style, see what they think about the world, stuff like that. You get a feel for them, and you get to like figure, hey, should I actually read an entire book by this person if I'm not enjoying this essay or having a difficult time following this essay? But yeah, overall, yeah, I'd recommend this. Although I the Shock Doctrine probably applies more to right now. And, Klein this is Naomi Klein's first book, so, her more recent books probably apply to now as well. Also on the back of the Shock Doctrine, we have a Howard Zinn quote. This is a brilliant book, one of the most important I have read in a long time. And Howard Zinn, of course, A People's History of the United States, which, yes, join my Discord if you want to read that with me in the month of October. All right, but yeah, that's everything. See ya.